Helen Keller, The Story of My Life, Chapter 11. In the autumn I returned to my southern home with a heart full of joyous memories. As I recall that visit north, I am filled with wonder at the richness and variety of the experiences that cluster about it. It seems to have been the beginning of everything. The treasures of new, beautiful world were laid at my feet, and I took in pleasure and information at every turn. I lived myself into all things. I was never still a moment. My life was as full of motion as those little insects that crowd a whole existence into one brief day. I met many people who talked with me by spelling into my hand, and thought and joyous sympathy leaped up to meet thought, and behold, a miracle had been wrought. The barren places between my mind and the minds of others blossomed like the rose. I spent the autumn months with my family at our summer cottage, on a mountain about 14 miles from Tuscumbia. It was called Fern Quarry because near it there was a limestone quarry long since abandoned. 3 frolicsome little streams ran through it from springs in the rocks above, leaping here and tumbling there in laughing cascades wherever the rocks tried to bar their way. The opening was filled with ferns which completely covered the beds of limestone and in places hid the streams. The rest of the mountain was thickly wooded. Here were great oaks and splendid evergreens with trunks like mossy pillars, from the branches of which hung garlands of ivy and mistletoe and persimmon trees, the odor of which pervaded every nook and corner of the wood, an elusive, fragrant something that made the heart glad. In places wild muscane and scuppering vines stretched from tree to tree, making arbors which were always full of butterflies and buzzing insects. It was delightful to lose ourselves in the green hollows of that tangled wood in the late afternoon, and to smell the cool, delicious odors that came up from the earth at the close of day. Our cottage was a sort of rough camp, beautifully situated on the top of a mountain among oaks and pines. The small rooms were arranged on each side of a long open hall. Round the house was a wide piazza where the mountain's winds blew, sweet with all the wood scents. We lived on the piazza most of the time. There we worked, ate, and played. At the back door there was a great butternut tree, round with the steps that had been built, and in front of the trees stood so close that I could touch them and feel the wind shake their branches, or the leaves twirl downward in the autumn blast. Many visitors came to Fern Quarry. In the evening by the campfire the men played cards and whiled around the hours to talk and sport. They told stories of their wonderful feats with fowl, fish, and quadruped, how many wild ducks and turkeys they had shot, what savage trout they had caught, and how they had bagged the craftiest foxes, outwitted the most clever possums, and overtaken the fleetest deer, until I thought that the surly lion, the tiger, and the bear, and the rest of the wild tribe would not be able to stand before these wild hunters. "Tomorrow to the chase," was their good-night shout as the circle of merry friends broke up for the night. The men slept in the hall outside our door, and I could feel the deep breathing of the dogs and the hunters as they lay on their improvised beds. At dawn I was awakened by the smell of coffee, the rattling of guns, and the heavy footsteps of the men as they strode about, promising themselves the greatest luck of the season. I could also feel the stamping of the horses, which they had ridden out from town and hitched under the trees, where they stood all night, neighing loudly, impatient to be off. At last the men mounted, and as they say in old songs, away went the steeds with bridles ringing and whips cracking and hounds racing ahead, and went away the champion hunters with hark and whoop and wild halloo. Later in the morning we made preparations for a barbecue. A fire was kindled at the bottom of a deep hole in the ground. Big sticks were laid crosswise at the top, and meat was hung from them and turned on spits. Around the fire squatted negroes, driving away the flies with long branches. The savory odor of the meat made me hungry long before the tables were set. When the bustle and excitement of preparation was at its height, the hunting party made its appearance, struggling in by twos and threes, the men hot and weary, the horses covered with foam, and the jaded hounds panting and dejected, and not a single kill. Every man declared that he had seen at least one deer, and that the animal had come very close, but however hotly the dogs might pursue the game, however well the guns might be aimed, at the snap of the trigger there was not a deer in sight. They had been as fortunate as the little boy who said he came very near seeing a rabbit. He saw his tracks. The party soon forgot its disappointment, however, and we sat down, not to venison, but to a tamer feast of veal and roast pig. One summer I had my pony at Fern Quarry. I called him Black Beauty, as I had just read the book, and he resembled the namesake in every way, from his glossy black coat to the white star on his forehead. I spent many of my happiest hours on his back. Occasionally, when it was quite safe, my teacher would let go the leading rein, and the pony sauntered on or stomped on its sweet will to eat grass or nibble the leaves of the trees that grew beside the narrow trail. On mornings when I did not care for the ride, my teacher and I would start after breakfast for a ramble in the woods, and allow ourselves to get lost amid the trees and vines with no road to follow except the paths made by cows and horses. Frequently we came upon impassable thickets which forced us to take a roundabout way. We always returned to the cottage with armfuls of laurel, goldenrod, ferns, and gorgeous swamp flowers, such that only grow in the south. Sometimes I would go with Mildred and my little cousins to gather persimmons. I did not eat them, but I loved their fragrance and enjoyed hunting for them in the leaves and grass. We also went nutting, and I helped to open the chestnut burrs and break the shells of hickory nuts and walnuts, the big sweet walnuts. At the foot of the mountain there was a railroad, and the children watched the trains whiz by. Sometimes a terrific whistle brought us to the steps, and Mildred told me in great excitement that a cow or a horse had strayed on the track. About a mile distant there was a trestle spanning a deep gorge. It was very difficult to walk over. The ties were wide apart and so narrow that one felt as if one were walking on knives. I had never crossed it until one day Mildred, Miss Sullivan, and I were lost in the woods and wandering for hours without finding a path. Suddenly Mildred pointed with her little hand and exclaimed, "There's the trestle!" We would have taken any way rather than this, but it was late and growing dark, and the trestle was a short cut home. I had to feel for the rails with my toe, but I was not afraid, and I got on very well, until all at once there came a faint puff, puff from the distance. "I see the train!" cried Mildred, and in another minute it would have been upon us had we not climbed down on the cross braces while it rushed over our heads. I felt the hot breath from the engine on my face, and the smoke and ashes almost choked us. As the train rumbled by, the trestle shook and swayed until I thought we should be dashed to the chasm below. With the utmost difficulty we regained the track. Long after dark we reached home and found the cottage empty. The family were all hunting for us. It's an exciting way to end the chapter. If you've ever been on a railroad track and walking on a bridge, a trestle as they call it in the book, and a train coming, it's a scary thing to do, because climbing under the track and staying under the track when the train's zooming by. I remember how scary it was when that happened to me, and think how scary it was when it happened to Helen Keller when she's blind and deaf. So that was a really interesting chapter. The reason this book is so well known, Helen Keller, The Story of My Life, is because it's a really great book. It's one of the best autobiographies written by somebody, by anybody in general, but this one is also written by somebody that's blind and deaf. So that was chapter 11 of Helen Keller, The Story of My Life.